Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Lostvell Chronicle. Before we begin, take a second to comment where you're watching from, and the exact time you're hearing this story. It's always fascinating to see where these forgotten pieces of Ozark history travel in the middle of the night. Tonight's case isn't folklore. It isn't an urban legend. It isn't a ghost story whispered on front porches. It's a documented investigation from the Arkansas Ozarks, one so disturbing that the state archives kept it sealed for decades. A case involving a widow who arrived with no past, a farmhouse with a history of disappearances, and a ledger containing names that never should have been there. Dim the lights. Settle in. The autumn of 1927 settled over the Arkansas Ozarks with a strange stillness, the kind that makes even seasoned mountain folk pause before stepping onto their porches. In the small town of Jasper, where limestone bluffs towered above winding hollows and the Buffalo River cut through the land like an ancient scar, residents had long grown accustomed to oddities. Isolation teaches people to accept what they cannot explain. But even the Ozarks, with all their mysteries, were unprepared for the woman who arrived one grey October morning. She called herself Cordelia Whitmore. She rode into Jasper in a black Model T Ford that looked as though it had been polished for the journey. The vehicle rolled to a stop outside the county clerk's office with a quiet authority, the engine cutting out in a single smooth breath. People noticed immediately. In a town where strangers were rare and widows common, Cordelia stood out like a misplaced figure in a familiar painting. She stepped out carrying only a single leather satchel, worn but well kept. Her clothes were modest, but her composure carried an odd weight, as if she were a woman who had rehearsed every motion long before making it. She walked with a measured precision that was neither hurried nor hesitant. Every movement felt predetermined. When she spoke to County Clerk Barnabas Fletcher about renting the long-abandoned Kensington place, her voice was calm, steady, and colourless. She produced 6 months' rent in crisp, sequential bills, money so fresh it struck Fletcher as almost unsettling. Her story was simple: recently widowed, seeking solitude, hoping to begin anew in a quiet place. But something in her tone betrayed none of the raw edges that grief typically leaves behind. It was her eyes that unsettled people most, pale blue to the point of translucence, so light they seemed almost without pigment. Residents would later say that speaking to her felt like trying to hold a conversation with the surface of a frozen lake, still, reflective, and impossibly cold. Cordelia had chosen the Kensington place, the farmhouse sitting alone on 43 acres, abandoned since the mysterious disappearance of the Kensington family a decade earlier. Locals assumed no one would ever live there again. Farms forgot by their owners tend to be forgotten by everyone else too. But Cordelia accepted the keys with a faint smile, as though the desolate house were exactly what she had been looking for. From the moment she arrived, her behavior followed a pattern that drew quiet attention. She appeared in town only twice a week, always on Tuesdays and Fridays at the exact same hour. She spoke only when spoken to, answered no question with more than what was required, and volunteered nothing about her past. Her posture was perfect, her routines unwavering, her presence oddly dissonant with the land she now inhabited. The people of Jasper had weathered storms, wars, and loss. They knew the look of sorrow, of hardship, of someone trying to escape a painful history. But Cordelia Whitmore was something else entirely. Not grieving, not healing, not hiding. Just wrong. In a way no one could name, yet everyone could feel. Kensington Place had always been an uneasy landmark in Jasper, the kind of house people pointedly avoided mentioning after sunset. Perched on a rocky rise above the hollow, the farmhouse stood as a silhouette of unanswered questions. The property had been empty for a decade, long enough for dust to reclaim the floors, vines to creep through the porch railings, and time to soften the memory of what had happened there. But not enough time to erase it. In February of 1917, the Kensington family, Jeremiah, his wife Zelda, and their 2 children, vanished in a single night. No struggle, No footprints in the snow, no signs of departure. Neighbors who found the house described a scene that felt frozen in motion. Breakfast dishes still warm on the table, fires gone cold, clothing still in closets, tools neatly hung in the barn, savings untouched beneath a floorboard. It was as though the family had stepped outside and simply dissolved into the winter air. The farmhouse remained exactly as it had been the day they disappeared, and locals believed it should stay that way, untouched, unoccupied, a relic of a mystery too heavy to disturb. But Cordelia Whitmore did not share that belief. From the moment she took possession of Kensington Place, she approached the house not with sentiment or caution, but with a kind of clinical detachment. The property became less of a home and more of a specimen, something to be measured, examined, understood. She moved through the rooms with methodical precision, not rearranging the remnants of the Kensingtons so much as evaluating them. Neighbors watching from the distant ridge noticed it almost immediately. At night, lights appeared in patterns that made no earthly sense. Sometimes the farmhouse stayed dark for days. Sometimes it blazed with light from every window until the early hours of the morning. Other nights, a single lantern passed room to room, pausing for long, unnatural intervals, as though Cordelia were taking inventory of the house's silence. But the windows revealed little. The curtains were drawn, or worse, replaced with heavy, opaque fabric that allowed no glimpse inside. Cordelia's movements were visible only as fleeting shadows crossing the panes. During the day, anyone who managed a visit spoke afterward of a house that felt occupied but not lived in. The furniture remained placed exactly as the Kensingtons had left it, yet the surfaces bore signs of subtle disruption. Dust wiped in clean, narrow paths, chairs nudged a few inches out of their original positions, rugs misaligned by the width of a palm. Rooms with no practical purpose showed faint signs of recent use, footprints in patterns too orderly for casual walking, windows opened and shut despite the cold. It was as if the house itself were being studied. Cordelia treated Kensington Place like a puzzle, whose pieces she intended to arrange into an answer no one else could see. And each day the property grew stranger, more hollow, more detached from the rhythms of ordinary life. To the people of Jasper, the farmhouse was haunted not by ghosts, but by intent. Cordelia's intent. That made it far more unsettling. Because the Kensingtons had vanished without explanation. And now, for reasons no one could guess, Cordelia Whitmore seemed determined to uncover something in the silence they left behind. In Jasper, patterns matter. People notice who comes to town, who leaves, who lingers a little too long at the general store counter. But what the residents noticed most about Cordelia Whitmore was not what she did. It was the precision with which she did it. Every Tuesday and Friday, without fail, the black Model T would rumble into town at exactly 9 o'clock. Cordelia stepped out of the vehicle the same way each time. One hand on the door, one hand on her satchel, face expressionless, posture unnervingly straight. She walked the same path, general store, post office, then back to the car, never speaking unless spoken to, never straying even a foot from her routine. Her shopping list never changed. Flour, salt, lamp oil, coffee, occasionally canned peaches or powdered soap, but never anything extra. No sweets, no fabric, no small indulgences that most widows allowed themselves during hard seasons. She purchased as though she were provisioning a life she did not completely inhabit. When neighbors attempted conversation, they found her answers perfectly polite but empty, like words repeated from memory rather than offered from experience. Ask where she lived before Jasper, and she would say, Little Rock, mostly, though the details shifted with each telling. Sometimes she claimed she had lived near the river. Other times she described a neighborhood closer to the old trolley line. Even her age seemed to drift, depending on the listener, mid-40s, early 50s, perhaps younger still. The story of her late husband changed as often as the weather. He passed in the spring, she told Isadora Hartwell. Last winter, she murmured to Prudence Ashworth. A few years ago, she mentioned to Hosea McNeil while inspecting flour sacks. Each version delivered with the same gentle, hollow smile. If anyone questioned her inconsistencies, she simply tilted her head and apologized, softly, as if grief had blurred the details. But grief is rarely that tidy, rarely that controlled, and Cordelia's answers carried none of the tremor of remembrance. They felt rehearsed. The only person in Jasper who saw through the thin veil of her politeness was Reverend Matthias Crowley. After 2 visits to Kensington Place, he found himself troubled in a way he could not name. His training had taught him to recognize sorrow, denial, guilt, even anger. These emotions leave trails, clues, in posture, voice, eyes. But Cordelia Whitmore showed none of them. It wasn't that she hid her feelings, it was that she seemed to possess no feelings to hide. Speaking with her gave Crowley the unsettling impression of addressing an exquisitely crafted mask, one that responded when prompted, but reflected nothing human beneath. During his second visit, he tried a different tactic. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said gently, "grief often travels in silence. If you ever wish to share your burden—" She interrupted with a serene smile. "My burdens are already arranged, Reverend. Everything is in order." Everything is in order. A phrase Crowley would later record in his private notes, underlined twice. What troubled him was not her lack of grief, but her lack of human texture. No curiosity, no nostalgia, no irritation, no warmth, not even the guardedness of a widow protecting painful memories. Instead, Cordelia Whitmore radiated a kind of calm that felt unnatural, as if she had studied how people behave rather than lived among them. She was not simply private, she was absent, a presence shaped by routine rather than emotion. In Jasper, people knew how to read one another. But no one could read Cordelia Whitmore. For most of his life, Jeremiah Pike trusted what his senses told him. The trenches of France had sharpened his awareness to a razor's edge, teaching him the difference between ordinary sounds and those that meant danger. After the war, his farm overlooking the hollow became a place where he could read the night like a book, where every whistle of wind, distant owl call, or shifting branch carried familiar meaning. But nothing in his experience prepared him for the nights after Cordelia Whitmore settled into the Kensington Place. It began subtly. A faint scraping carried across the hollow, so soft Pike wondered if it might be a tree limb dragging against a window. But there were no trees that close to the farmhouse, and the sound didn't match the rhythm of wind. It had intention behind it. A dragging, shifting scraping of heavy furniture across wooden floors, always between midnight and dawn. He began noting the occurrences in the small leather journal he kept to manage the remnants of his wartime nerves. November 3rd. Scraping again. South side of the house. Lasted 12 minutes. November 7th. Longer tonight. Not wind. Something moving objects from room to room. November 12th. Horses restless. Bella nearly broke her halter. The scraping was always followed by lights. Lanterns or lamps, he could never tell which, appeared in the windows, drifting from room to room with slow, deliberate pacing. At first, he thought Cordelia must be rearranging the old Kensington belongings, perhaps sorting through what remained of the vanished family's possessions. But the movements became too rhythmic, too patterned. Sometimes the lights paused in a single room for nearly an hour before moving to the next. Other nights, they traced a looping path through the second floor, then down the staircase, then up again, like someone conducting an inspection, room by room, with obsessive repetition. Ever, a pattern ended the same way. At exactly 3:00 a.m., all lights snapped off. Never 2:59, never 3:01. Not once did he see Cordelia herself in the windows. The animals noticed before the humans did. Pike's horses grew skittish on nights when the noises were loudest, stamping and blowing nervously at their stalls. The old mare, Hazel, refused to face the direction of the Kensington place after dark, jerking her head violently whenever Pike tried to turn her toward the hollow. His dogs reacted even worse. Loyal, fearless animals bred for hunting in rugged terrain, they began refusing to leave the porch after sundown. One night, when Pike tried coaxing his hound Rufus toward the fence line, the dog whimpered, and backed away, tail tucked, eyes fixed on the shadowed hill where the Kensington place stood. Something was wrong there, something the animals understood instinctively. Pike decided he needed answers. During a chance meeting at Hartwell's general store, he mentioned the noises. Cordelia listened politely, her pale eyes unreadable. Her explanation came smoothly, too smoothly. "Oh, that. I've been rearranging some of my late husband's belongings. Nights are simply the best time for sorting." Sorting. At 2:00 a.m. Every night. Pike lied and said her answer satisfied him, but he knew better. Soldiers are taught to hear the truth in a voice, and Cordelia's voice had none. No irritation, no embarrassment, no fatigue, just emptiness. As he watched her leave the store and step into her black Model T, he wrote one line in his journal. "She isn't rearranging anything. She's preparing something. And whatever it wasn't meant to be witnessed by anyone living." The winter of 1927 to 1928 struck the Arkansas Ozarks with a violence not seen in decades. Snow rose in drifts taller than fence posts, wind carved shrieking paths through the hollows, and the roads leading to the scattered farms disappeared beneath sheets of ice. Most residents of Jasper survived by gathering close, sharing food, labor, and news in the way mountain communities always had. But Cordelia Whitmore withdrew so completely that it was as though the winter swallowed her whole. Weeks passed without anyone seeing the black Model T leave Kensington Place. No smoke rose from the chimney. No tracks appeared near the porch. The house sat on its hilltop like a sealed chamber, untouched by the rhythms of the living world. Even Jeremiah Pike, who watched the property with soldiers' vigilance, saw nothing but darkness and drifting snow. By late January, concern outweighed unease. When the great blizzard finally loosened its grip, Isadora and Caleb Hartwell made the difficult climb to check on the widow. They expected to find her ill, starving, or worse. They did not expect what they found. Cordelia answered the door almost immediately, as though she had been standing just inside waiting for the knock. She looked thinner by half, her once sharp posture softened into something brittle. Her skin had taken on a translucent pallor, not the usual winter fade, but something deeper, like the blood beneath it had retreated. Her voice, when she spoke, carried a hollow timbre, as if echoing through an interior cavern. "Please come in," she whispered, though the invitation felt more formal than warm. Inside, the house was colder than the wind outside. The air carried no scent of wood smoke, no hint of cooking, no sign that fire had touched the hearth in weeks. The Hartwells kept their coats on, breath fogging as they stepped across the threshold. The rooms looked nothing like they remembered. Several windows were boarded over from the inside, the planks cut with exact, unnatural precision. Heavy curtains, thicker than anything sold locally, hung behind the boards, sealing out even imagined light. Other windows were bare, yet the rooms they belonged to were arranged in ways that defied logic. Chairs faced walls, tables stood angled into corners. Lamps sat in clusters on the floor, as though waiting for instructions. It felt less like a home, and more like a series of stations, placements chosen not by comfort, but by calculation. "We've been worried," Isadora ventured gently. "Winter has been harsh. You could have called for help." Cordelia smiled, but it was an empty gesture that never reached her pale eyes. "I appreciate your concern, truly, but I've been preparing." "For what?" Caleb asked before he could stop himself. Her gaze drifted toward the darkest hallway, where the boards creaked with distant, impossible sounds. "For visitors," she said softly. "They'll be coming soon. I must make sure everything is arranged." The Hartwells exchanged a glance, confusion wrapped in dread. Because nothing in the house was arranged for guests, nothing was arranged for humans at all. It was as though Cordelia had been shaping the space for someone, or something, that did not share the needs of living people. And the longer they lingered in that silent, freezing house, the more certain they felt that whatever she was preparing for had already begun to change her. When the winter finally loosened its hold on the Ozarks, Jasper's farms stirred back to life. Soil thawed, animals grazed again, and neighbors emerged from isolation to mend fences and plant spring crops. But on the hill where Kensington Place sat in its unsettling quiet, something entirely different was happening. Cordelia Whitmore began to plant a garden, but not one that resembled anything the townspeople had ever seen. The first sign came when Jeremiah Pike, walking the ridge to check on storm damage, noticed long, straight trenches carved into the hillside behind the farmhouse. They were unnaturally perfect, precise to the inch, equidistant, and laid out in a pattern that resembled a surveyor's map rather than a farmer's hand. Over the next 2 weeks, the trenches multiplied until they formed an enormous grid extending far beyond what a single woman could reasonably maintain. Then Cordelia filled them. Bent on her knees from dawn to dusk, she planted rows of seeds with ritualistic care, pressing each handful of soil as though sealing something beneath it. She worked silently, mechanically, her movements so measured that Pike felt as if he were watching a clockwork figure rather than a human being. Sometimes she stood perfectly still for minutes at a time, hands resting on the earth, head tilted in a listening posture, though the wind carried nothing but ordinary mountain silence. What disturbed Pike most was the design. The rows did not follow sunlight patterns or slope for drainage. Instead, they formed interlocking geometric shapes, circles within squares, lines converging at angles too deliberate to be accidental. It looked less like a garden and more like an enormous diagram etched into the land. Other neighbors noticed too. Word spread that the widow was planting enough food to feed half the valley, though she lived alone and bought supplies as though she barely. Some suggested she was grieving in her own way. Others whispered that grief did not explain patterns carved with mathematical precision. Then came the stranger part. Nothing grew. Not a single sprout pierced the soil, despite perfect rainfall. Even weeds avoided the place. It was as though the earth itself refused to participate in whatever Cordelia intended. When Reverend Crowley visited in early April, he found her kneeling among the barren rows, smoothing the soil with her fingertips. "You've worked hard," he said gently, "but there's nothing coming up. Have you considered replanting?" Cordelia turned, and the faint smile she offered chilled him more than any winter wind. "There's no need," she murmured. "Everything is proceeding as it should." "As it should?" Crowley asked. "Your garden isn't taking." She brushed her hands together, as though dusting off an invisible residue. "These aren't for me," she said. "They're for the visitors. They'll need provisions when they arrive." He didn't know how to respond. The tone of her voice wasn't hopeful or delusional. It was certain, as if she were discussing an event already scheduled and confirmed. Every motion she made felt ceremonial, not agricultural. She planted not to grow food, but to prepare a space, a grid, a map, a waiting place. Something about the way she shaped the land felt older than farming, and far more purposeful. As Crowley walked away, he found himself unable to shake the feeling that Cordelia had not planted a garden at all. She had drawn an invitation, By midsummer, rumors swirled through Jasper like dust on a hot wind. Cordelia's strange routines, her impossible garden, the boarded windows, the hollow-eyed transformation. People whispered about all of it. But gossip remained just gossip until the day 2 strangers arrived in town asking for Mrs. Cordelia Whitmore. They drove a polished Buick sedan, too fine for mountain roads, and too clean for men who claimed they had been traveling across 3 states. Both introduced themselves as cousins of Cordelia's late husband. They carried documents, letters, and even a faded photograph of the real couple. Their manner was polite but urgent, and their questions, sharp as razor blades, cut through the assumptions Jasper had grown comfortable with. When Barnabas Fletcher, the county clerk, brought out the rental agreement Cordelia had signed, one of the men went pale. "This isn't her handwriting," he said quietly. The second man unfolded a creased death certificate from St. Louis, dated 1925. "Cordelia Whitmore died 2 years ago," he said. "Influenza. We buried her ourselves." Silence fell over the clerk's office. Fletcher felt the bottom of his stomach drop in a way he hadn't since the war years. The room seemed to tilt, as if reality itself was shifting its weight. "The woman living at Kensington Place," Fletcher whispered, "isn't your cousin's widow?" The men exchanged a grim look. "No," the elder said. "She's an imposter, and we intend to find out who she really is." Against Fletcher's warnings, they drove straight toward the Kensington Place, promising to return with answers by nightfall. They never returned. By morning, their Buick was found abandoned a quarter-mile down the old dirt road leading to Cordelia's rented farmhouse. The doors were unlocked. Their luggage remained untouched in the trunk. Wallets, cash, watches, everything of value was still inside, arranged neatly, as though someone had catalogued each item before walking away. But the men themselves were gone. There were no footprints, no signs of struggle, no indication they had ever left the car. A search party formed as the sun climbed over the ridge. They approached the Kensington Place with cautious dread, expecting violence, or bodies, or some trace of a confrontation. Instead, they found something worse. The house was empty, completely, utterly, impossibly empty. Cordelia Whitmore, or whoever she was, had vanished. The boards remained on the windows. The strange furniture arrangement still disrupted the rooms. The soil of the vast geometric garden lay untouched, as barren as the day she planted it. But there was no trace of her clothing, no food, no footprints, not even the faintest imprint of bedclothes disturbed or dishes last used. It was as though she had evaporated. Reverend Crowley, standing in the doorway of the cold, echoing house, felt something hollow crack open in his chest. For months Jasper had tolerated unease, dismissed strangeness and rationalized the irrational. But the disappearance of the 2 men, their car left behind like a discarded shell, and the widow's silent flight forced a single horrifying truth upon the town. The danger had never been speculation. It had been real from the moment she arrived, and it had been living among them, studying them, preparing for something they still did not understand. Once it became clear that Cordelia Whitmore had vanished, and that the 2 men who'd come searching for her had vanished as well, Sheriff Tobias Hartwell organized the most thorough search Newton County had seen in years. Neighbors who'd once been content to keep quiet now approached the Kensington Place with grim determination, armed with lanterns, rifles, and the heavy dread of people who already suspect the truth is worse than anything they can imagine. At first glance, the house looked untouched. No overturned furniture, no broken dishes, no splintered doors. Nothing to suggest panic, struggle, or hurried departure. But the stillness felt wrong. The air smelled of dust and old iron. Every room held the unsettling emptiness of a place that had been used, but never lived in. It was Caleb Hartwell who discovered the door to the basement. Hidden behind a warped cupboard, the narrow entrance descended into darkness that swallowed the lantern light whole. As the men stepped down the creaking stairs, the temperature dropped sharply, as though the earth itself resisted their presence. When their lamps finally illuminated the space below, several of the men gasped. The basement, originally just a root cellar and storage space, had been transformed into something monstrous. The floor plan made no sense. Wooden partitions had been erected to form tiny chambers, some barely large enough for a grown man to stand in. Hallways twisted and looped, doubling back on themselves in patterns that felt more psychological than architectural, as if someone had built them not for utility but for control. The walls were worse. From floor to ceiling, every surface was covered in tally marks, thousands of them, scratched into the wood in tight, relentless clusters. Some were neat and evenly spaced, others carved frantically, gouged deep enough to splinter the boards. The marks were grouped in sequi, enses, sets of 5, sets of 7, sometimes long, unbroken lines that stretched the full height of a wall. "What in God's name is this?" someone whispered. No one answered. In the largest chamber they found a wooden table covered with personal items, jewellery, pocket watches, rings, buttons, hair combs, belt buckles, spectacles. Some pieces were fine and expensive, others were plain and worn, but all of them had once belonged to someone, and many bore engraved initials. A sickening realization settled over the group. These were not heirlooms or keepsakes. They were trophies. Jeremiah Pike, lantern trembling in his grip, noticed a leather-bound book placed neatly at the center of the table. The ledger. Its pages contained rows of names, dates, and locations written in a precise feminine script. But beside each name were coded symbols, unreadable notations that hinted at patterns and rituals the men could not decipher. Some names appeared once, others appeared 3 or 4 times, each entry paired with a different town or year. Some lines ended abruptly halfway across the page, as though whatever had happened to the person required no further notation. Then they reached the final entry, a date only days old. But instead of a name, the space was filled with a single mark. No initials, no code, just a question, a placeholder, a waiting space. And with that, the truth settled in the cold air like dust. Cordelia Whitmore, or whoever she truly was, had been doing this for years. Long before Jasper, long before the Ozarks, long before anyone here knew her name. They had not been dealing with a grieving widow. They had been hosting a predator, one who recorded everything, and who, it seemed, had not finished. The discovery of the basement and the ledger filled with names, dates, and coded symbols forced the Newton County Sheriff to call in help from the state capital. Within days, federal investigators arrived in Jasper, bringing with them a level of scrutiny the town had never experienced. They approached Kensington Place with gloves, masks, and the cautious silence of men who already knew what kind of nightmare they were stepping into. The evidence spread across the farmhouse told a story the townsfolk had only glimpsed in fragments. But to the investigators, it was immediately clear Cordelia Whitmore had never existed. Not the woman they'd met, not the widow who rented the house, not the pale stranger with the unfathomable eyes. Her name, her marriage, her age, everything had been borrowed, stolen, or fabricated. Through handwriting analysis, forged documents, and state records, federal agents uncovered 5 additional identities used by the same woman between 1923 and 1927. Each identity was tied to a different region: Missouri, Tennessee, Kentucky, northern Arkansas. And each was carefully constructed around a similar story: a recently widowed woman seeking quiet refuge in a rural community. In each of those communities, investigators now realized people had gone missing. Farmhands, itinerant preachers, traveling salesmen, railroad workers passing through, elderly men living alone on the edge of town, women with no immediate family, loners and wanderers whose departures could be dismissed as voluntary, victims chosen precisely because their absences did not create alarm. The more federal agents compared missing person reports to the entries in Cordelia's ledger, the clearer her pattern became. She registered under a false name, stayed long enough to learn the geography, identified vulnerable individuals, and then vanished before anyone could connect her presence to T. Disappearances. She preyed on communities that trusted strangers out of necessity, and she exploited every unspoken rule of rural hospitality. But what disturbed investigators most was what didn't fit the model. It wasn't about money. Personal items were taken, but cash was often left behind. Victims' valuables were catalogued, but not sold. There was no evidence of ransom, extortion, or transportation of goods. The killings, if that is what they were, showed no profit motive. One federal psychologist, after examining the basement chambers and the coded ledger, offered a chilling assessment. This is ritualistic behavior, compulsive, organized. She isn't acting out of need. She's fulfilling a system only she understands. Another expert disagreed, insisting that the sophistication of her false identities suggested help, a larger criminal network that taught her methods or provided forged documents. But most investigators believed the opposite. She worked alone. Not because she lacked opportunity, but because she preferred it, because solitude was not a burden for her. It was where she functioned best. By the time authorities widened their search to other states, she had already disappeared beyond any traceable trail. No sightings, no transactions, no new identities emerging in public records. It was as if she dissolved into the same cold silence from which she had first emerged. All that remained was her legacy, a map of disappearances stretching across 3 states and more than a decade, all linked not by evidence but by absence. A predator without a past, a woman without a name, a void wearing human skin. And somewhere beyond the hills of Jasper, she was still out there. In the years following the investigation, the Kensington place stood like a scar on the hillside, an empty, skeletal reminder of everything the town wished to forget. For a while, people attempted to treat it as they had before Cordelia arrived, a property with a strange past but no present danger. Yet the silence around it felt heavier now, charged with the memory of the basement, the ledger, and the names no one could erase. Then, one night in 1943, during a routine survey for wartime land use, officials found the farmhouse burned to the ground. The fire had been deliberate. Accelerant traces soaked the soil, and the basement had been filled in with stones. No one claimed responsibility. No investigation followed. The county simply recorded the structure as destroyed and moved on. But the people of Jasper knew better. They understood that someone, perhaps a neighbor, perhaps a drifter, perhaps someone who knew too much, had decided that the Kensington place should not stand another season. And privately no one disagreed. The hollow felt lighter without it, but not entirely healed. The land remained untouched for generations. No houses built, no fences laid. Livestock wandered around the perimeter but never stepped onto the foundation. It was as if even the animals sensed what had lived there. By the 1950s, the story of Cordelia Whitmore became local folklore, though older residents refused to tell it lightly. Children dared each other to approach the hollow, but none ever lingered long. Hunters marked it on their maps as a place to bypass. The air carried an uneasy stillness, an instinctive boundary drawn not by superstition, but by memory. Then in 1963, a researcher named Dr. Margaret Stillwell reopened the case. A meticulous academic from the University of Arkansas, she believed she could piece together the truth using modern criminological methods. She interviewed Ella. Durley residents reviewed the ledger and traveled across 3 states retracing Cordelia's earlier identities. Her work was careful, thorough, and unsettlingly accurate. And then she vanished. Her car was found on a rural road near the Missouri border. The driver's door open, her notes inside, her coat neatly folded on the passenger seat. No sign of struggle, no signs of travel, no footprints leading away. It was as if the landscape had simply absorbed her. Her colleagues insisted she met with foul play. Locals whispered something different. Cordelia wasn't done. Whether they meant the woman, the legend, or something larger, no one clarified. Over time, the case slipped from official records, sealed in state archives, and referenced only in footnotes of criminal psychology texts. But in the Ozarks, the memory lived on, not as a ghost story, but as a warning. Because Cordelia, or whoever she truly was, had revealed a truth far more terrifying than any haunting. A predator can wear the face of a widow. A threat can smile politely from the porch, and danger can arrive not with violence, but with courtesy. Her lesson to the mountains was simple and chilling. Some strangers don't come to join a community. Some come to study it, and sometimes to feed on it. And long after her disappearance, the hollow where the Kensington place once stood remained empty. A silent testament to what happens when trust meets something that is not human at all. If you've stayed with this story until now, thank you. Cases like this remind us that the most terrifying mysteries aren't supernatural. They're human. If you'd like more deep dives into forgotten American cases, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss when we uncover another story lost to time. And before you go, tell me in the comments, would you have trusted Cordelia Whitmore, or would you have kept your distance? Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and good night from the Lostvell Chronicle.